Droplets of blood fell from the marble altar, while silence blanketed the city of Rome. Torches danced against the temple's stone walls, throwing elongated shadows that appeared to creep nearer with every breath of wind. The year was 37 AD, and a new ruler had claimed power. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history by a single notorious title, Caligula, the most horrifying sexual behaviors of Caligula. The madness was not merely gossip murmured in wine-filled taverns. These were actual events etched into the existence of senators, warriors, and enslaved people alike, warping the soul of Rome into something monstrous. Caligula's origins were far from humble. His birth placed him within the ruling Julio-Claudian dynasty, the grandson of Mark Antony, the great-grandson of Augustus and the son of Germanicus. That cherished general whose triumphs had inspired devotion from Roman legions. Power surrounded Caligula from his earliest days. He traveled with the military forces where soldiers gave him the nickname Caligula, meaning little. Boots, because of the tiny soldier's uniform he dressed in. That child, beloved by the legions, would eventually command Rome's might not to fight external threats, but to turn against his own citizens. The shift from promise to terror happened quickly. When Caligula initially assumed the throne, people wept tears of happiness. Senators celebrated his kindness. Celebrations filled the streets. Following the harsh reign of Tiberius, Rome thought a rescuer had arrived. However, in just a few months, the facade crumbled. Beneath, the pleasant exterior lurked fixations on sex, degradation, and the obliteration of all limits. Rome had not crowned a savior, but a hunter. What transforms a man's appetite into the nightmare of an entire empire? Ancient historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio chronicle a rule where governance and depravity merged until no household remained protected. He allegedly engaged in relations with his own sisters, pulling them into his bed as though their royal blood was merely another treasure to possess. Were you aware that? Caligula even displayed his sister Drusilla at banquets, not as family, but as a companion, compelling senators to observe in silence? This was not simply desire. This was the performance of supremacy. Picture the Senate chamber wrapped in the solemnity of generations. Senators enter, their robes substantial, their spirits more burdened still. Caligula, seated on his throne, declares his command. Wives can be claimed at his whim. A senator observes as his spouse is called, shaking into the emperor's private rooms. Hours pass before she reappears, drained of color and voiceless, her gaze locked on the marble beneath her feet, while her husband must bow as if nothing occurred. Authority was no longer about legislation or military strength. It concerned the domination of the most personal connections. The empire transformed into his platform. At public feasts, he reportedly selected noble women randomly, dragging them behind curtains, then emerging with mocking remarks about their responses. These women robbed of. Their honor returned to households where their families could not acknowledge what happened. To oppose meant inviting execution. To submit meant surrendering one's identity. Caligula grasped something terrifying, that to possess the flesh was to possess the spirit. Rome's customs of matrimony, holy promises, and familial pride became mere toys. In one infamous incident, Caligula arranged the marriage of his faithful officer's wife, Ennia, only to take her for himself. He ridiculed the sacred nature of the ritual by converting it into a revolting display where Rome's principles were violated openly. For Caligula, sacred commitments were not meant for reverence. They existed to be shattered for amusement. Were you aware that Caligula's own residence was allegedly converted into a house of prostitution? Ancient records describe hallways where noble women were compelled to service strangers while the emperor collected profits from the degradation. This was not simple excess. This was a purposeful reversal of Roman virtue. The palace of the Caesars, previously a representation of holy power, turned into a marketplace of dishonor. The payment was not precious metal, but personal worth, yet the atrocities extended beyond Rome's upper classes. Enslaved people and servants already without power suffered the worst of his cravings. Picture the kitchens where a young servant girl receives a summons after dark. She enters chambers thick with fragrance. The emperor waits, his stare filled with malice. She understands that fighting back means agony. She understands that yielding means permanent silence. Neither option preserves her humanity. Caligula's depravities were not concealed in darkness. They were displayed openly. Public degradation became official practice. At gladiatorial contests, he occasionally commanded the wives of aristocrats to sit near him, then issued whispered commands that reduced them to instruments of his craving. Rome's masses shouted for violence in the arena, but in the emperor's viewing, area lives were being destroyed in more subtle, more crushing ways. Why did Rome tolerate it? Dread, terror muzzled every voice. The Taurian Guard, sworn to defend the emperor, followed his commands. Senators stripped of authority bowed more deeply with each affront. The citizens who had once welcomed him as a deliverer now spoke only in darkness. Rome had fashioned an emperor with divine authority, and in Caligula, divinity had become horrifying. Think about the emotional devastation. A mother witnesses her daughter being taken into the palace, never able to speak again of what transpired within. A husband suppresses his fury as he bows before the man who assaulted his wife. A sister stripped of selfhood is paraded as both relative and paramour. These were not random occurrences. They formed the framework of Caligula's rule. Were you aware that Caligula proclaimed himself a living deity, demanding reverence even as his offenses multiplied? Temples echoed with prayers forced from frightened lips, while behind locked doors, those same worshippers suffered his most personal torments. Faith itself became another instrument of humiliation. To deny worship meant betrayal. To engage meant feeding the madness. Rome's marble structures could not hold back the odor of terror. Warriors, senators, nobles, and enslaved people all existed under one reality. No limit existed that Caligula would not violate. The principles of kinship, the holiness of marriage, the privacy of the body, everything collapsed under his attention. Still, behind the terror, uncertainties remained. How could a man nurtured in the center of Rome, offspring of its most adored general, fall into such insanity? Was it mental illness? Was it the corruption of total authority? Or was Rome itself responsible for granting holy power to a mortal who understood divinity only through brutality? The banquet tables stayed laden with delicacies. The arenas thundered with entertainment, and the palaces sparkled with marble. Yet underneath the splendor, Rome had transformed into a prison. Every chuckle at Caligula's humor was compelled. Every celebration was empty. The empire's lifeblood carried not honor, but fear. This marked the start of a rule where authority became impossible to separate from depravity, and where the emperor's bedroom inspired more fear than the combat field. Rome had weathered conflicts, diseases, and plots, but could it weather an emperor whose cravings devoured the very foundation of civilization? The resolution would arrive, but first, Rome had to persist, and the empire would discover in the most personal and devastating manner that sometimes the most lethal weapon is not the blade, but appetite released without limitation. The nighttime skies above Rome frequently shimmered with firelight. But under Caligula's control, those flames revealed horrors the city had never previously witnessed. His palace, once the pulsing center of imperial power, transformed into a maze of terror, desire, and debasement. The most horrifying sexual behaviors of Caligula and the madness were not rumors restricted to private rooms. They occurred in public chambers, religious ceremonies, even inside the Senate itself. Authority and intimacy combined into one revolting spectacle, and every Roman senator, warrior, enslaved person risked becoming part of the emperor's show. Caligula's oppression converted the holy into the profane. He allegedly violated the Vestal Virgins, women pledged to 3 decades of purity, protectors of Rome's eternal fire.
Removed from their sanctuary, they became unwilling actors in his games. Were you aware that destroying a Vestal's promise was deemed the supreme blasphemy, punished by being buried alive? Yet under Caligula, their innocence was not destroyed by secret admirers, but by the emperor himself, who transformed their sacred bodies into symbols of shame. The Senate chamber itself, the marble surfaces, the decorated benches, the sculptures of Rome's ancestors became participants in his wickedness. Senators appeared, expecting announcements about levies or military campaigns, only to be compelled to observe as their wives or daughters were summoned, exhibited, and dishonored. Picture the empty silence. Senators gazing forward, expressions like granite, as their family's honor was torn apart before them. To object meant death. To survive meant existing without respect. Still, the humiliation deepened even further when Caligula expanded his authority to the very ties of blood. Records describe his fixation on his sisters, Drusilla, Agrippina, and Julia Livilla. He displayed them at feasts, suggesting openly at forbidden unions. Drusilla, his preferred sister, was treated as an empress, positioned beside him as though she were spouse rather than sibling. When she perished unexpectedly, he grieved her as though she were his wife, making her a goddess in temples. For Rome, the separation between family and corruption vanished before their sight. Caligula's brutality was not simply indulgence. It was deliberate degradation. He recognized the power of display. In one disturbing practice, he showcased noblewomen at celebrations, compelling them to abandon their husband's company and accompany him to private chambers. When they emerged, he ridiculed them openly, revealing intimate particulars to the amusement of attendees. Picture the searing shame of a matron, her private being examined as entertainment, her husband compelled to laugh or face execution. Rome's aristocracy became performers in the emperor's revolting drama, robbed of honor, their existences rewritten in humiliation. Were you aware Caligula allegedly transformed sections of his palace into a brothel, staffed not with courtesans, but with the wives of senators and knights? Visitors were invited or commanded to pay for entry, the earnings flowing into the emperor's treasury. What had previously been Rome's center of administration became a market of debasement. Coins rang on marble surfaces, but the actual price was calculated in destroyed families and violated sanctity. The empire's faith, too, became twisted into an instrument of sexual oppression. Announcing himself a living god, Caligula demanded tributes not only of incense and currency, but of flesh. He presented himself as Jupiter made manifest, even displaying himself in the armor of deities, and compelled Rome to submit to his delusions. Picture the dread of priests forced to conduct rituals that were half devotion, half debauchery, understanding that refusal meant death. The separation between religion and depravity blurred until both were impossible to distinguish in the emperor's perception. Enslaved people, often invisible in Rome's magnificence, endured perhaps the greatest suffering. Young girls and boys, purchased or captured, were trained not in duties, but in obedience. Their screams were stifled by palace barriers, but the resonance of their anguish filled every section of Rome. In the kitchens, a cook might murmur to another about the cries heard after dark. In the passages, guards averted their gaze. Understanding silence meant survival. Every stratum of Roman civilization, from the most powerful senator to the most powerless enslaved person, carried the burden of his appetites. Yet Caligula's sexual behaviors were not limited to Rome exclusively. When he journeyed, his desire journeyed with him. During religious processions, he halted ceremonies mid-ritual to claim whoever captured his attention. In the territories, local leaders trembled at his coming, understanding their daughters and wives could be called without notice. Rome's empire extended across continents, but no separation protected its citizens from the reach of one man's cravings. And what about the populace, the common Romans, who occupied the streets, markets, and amphitheaters? They murmured of his insanity, of his endless desire. But murmurs were risky. Spies existed everywhere. A single reckless comment could result in torture, banishment, or execution. So dread transformed into collaboration. Masses cheered at his public appearances, even as they recognized the man they praised was destroying the very essence of their city. Were you aware that Caligula once commanded the marriage of a bride and groom to be disrupted on their wedding night, claiming the bride for himself? The action was not passion, but theater. The theft of purity, the breaking of promises, the destruction of faith, all for the satisfaction of witnessing devotion collapse under his will. For Rome, matrimony itself ceased to be holy. By the conclusion of his rule, Caligula's sexual oppression had eroded the empire's structure. The Senate had lost all respect. Households existed in dread of calls to the palace. Religion was mocked. Marriage was profaned. Even the word Rome, once a representation of order and power, had become connected with dishonor under foreign observation. Allies whispered of the emperor's lunacy. Adversaries laughed at the empire that submitted to one man's depravities. Yet authority born of dread always creates resistance. Within the Praetorian Guard, devotion fractured. Warriors who once followed every command now grumbled behind locked doors. Senators who had suffered humiliation nurtured hidden anger. Rome had been paralyzed by terror, but terror can only silence people for so long before it crystallizes into determination. And so in January of 41 AD, the firelight of Rome flickered once more. Caligula walked through the palace, intoxicated by his divinity, unaware that blades awaited in the darkness. The same guards who once implemented his desire now turned on him, stabbing him in passages that had witnessed his darkest offenses. Blood spread across marble, and with it ended the rule of the man who had made Rome a brothel of humiliation. Still, his death did not remove the wounds. Wives stripped of honor, husbands shattered in silence, sisters converted into lovers, enslaved people mutilated in flesh and spirit. Rome could advance politically, but emotionally the empire bore the specters of his rule. History would ever remember the magnificence of Rome, yet beneath its achievements lay stories of debasement so deep that they could not be concealed. The legacy of Caligula cautions us of the perils of unlimited authority, of what happens when appetite becomes regulation, and when no separation exists between sovereign and subject. Rome granted one man the body of an empire, and he consumed it. And so history whispers its caution. The mightiest empires do not always collapse to foreign blades. Sometimes they decay from within, consumed by the hungers of those crowned as deities.